No, come on, man.
I don't like him. I don't like that offense.
Oh, 100%.
I like Kirk Cousins. I'll fight everyone on this.
He's one of these guys that I'm a big believer in.
Who would we have ranked higher right now?
Are you serious? You don't actually believe that. Hey everyone, welcome into the FantasyPros Football Podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Sylvester, joined as always by Mike Tagliere. We've got Kyle Yates back today. Kyle, what's going on, buddy?
Not much, man. It is good to be back on. I'm ready to talk some football.
Yeah, baby. Tags, what's going on, dude?
Nothing much. Just waiting for more NFL, non-actual player news to drop about Washington and what's going on behind the scenes. That's going to be a big story in the coming days, but we're not going to be talking about it on the podcast because we have no news to break right now.
I don't know if it's really going to be fantasy relevant either. Like, what are we going to talk about it if it doesn't
I
apply
don't
to
know.
fantasy whatsoever?
That's a good question. I mean, like my wife said, oh, you guys are going to have something to talk about in the podcast. And I was like, well, it really is not going to have a whole lot of fantasy implications. Yates, you can kind of tell them what's going on, that it's you've been following the story a lot more than Bobby and I have.
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's all rumors at this point. That
It's a lot of hearsay, right?
Yeah, that there are some really, really bad things happening behind the scenes and have been for a long time. Cover-ups, blackmails. It's just not good. So, I'm hoping that the news isn't as bad as all that, but it doesn't look like it's going to be that way.
Sure. All right, you guys ready to roll?
Ready to rock,
Yeah,
man.
let's do it.
All right, so here's what we're going to be talking about today. Last year, we did a show called Draft Strategies, and apparently it did really well. I'm letting you guys in behind the scenes. You're all family, right? Come on in, okay? It did really well, and so they were like, hey, let's do another draft strategy show. We hate draft strategies. I'm rebranding this right now. We're going draft tips, because draft strategies, they blow. So draft tips, draft no-nos. We've got 12 draft tips. Let's start with that. Tags, your first. What do you have, dude?
All right, first is something that I don't do enough of, and when you get caught in the middle of a draft, let's say, when the other day I did a live stream we were doing a mock draft against followers, and they were trying to beat me in this mock draft. I got the 12th pick in the draft, and it was like, I don't do this enough, and the tip is always assume the worst possible scenario. So when you're on the clock, you have before you're on the clock, you're going to have 4 or 5 guys in front of you that you're looking at, and you're looking at guys to draft, right? And then you're like, okay, I hope this guy falls. I hope this guy falls. If not, I'll take this guy. And all of a sudden, the dominoes fall exactly as you wouldn't want them to go. And then you're stuck on the clock deciding between players that you don't really want. And, if you're doing like an online draft, you might have 30 seconds, 1 minute, maybe even 90 seconds. But it goes by a lot faster when you don't prepare for the worst. And it's something that I struggle with, where it's like, all right, I want this player and this player. Please fall to me. And I'm just sitting there waiting for the other person to pick, rather than thinking, okay, if they take those players, who am I going to land on? I don't do that enough.
Who did you end up getting, by the way?
What's that?
Like, what is the worst case scenario at that 1-2 turn? Who'd you end up getting?
Well, at the 1-2 turn, I actually did get Kenyon Drake there, which I was pretty happy about. But then I was stuck with the other pick, and I was trying to decide because Julio Jones went, Davante Adams went, and Tyreek Hill was off the board. So I ended up taking Nick Chubb to pair with Kenyon Drake, and I wasn't really happy about it because I don't feel like Chubb should be a first-round pick, and that's basically a borderline first-round pick there. So I felt in a bad spot, and it was just, again, when you're on the clock, you're panicking a little bit. So always assume the worst case scenario.
I think that's totally fair. Yates, who do you want at the 1-2 turn? Because I don't like the 1-2 turn this year.
Hate it.
I don't either. I really hate being at the turn and setting the runs rather than, capitalizing on value. So at that point, especially in Superflex leagues, I hate being on the turn in Superflex leagues because at that point you're saying that I have to draft a quarterback, especially at that 1-2 turn. I have to draft a quarterback.
Otherwise, the whole run could go, and then you miss out on everything.
Exactly. There's 22 picks in between my next one, however many it is. At that point, I'm looking at, it's slim pickings at that point. So, yeah, I really do not like being at the turn, just based on that fact that you're setting the runs rather than just letting them fall to you.
I'd like being at the turn if I had Christian McCaffrey. I mean, that 2-3 turn is pretty ugly as well, typically. But you're right, Tags. You got to prepare for the worst case scenario because it happens a lot more often than you think, especially when you're Mike Tagliere and everybody has your draft rankings in front of you.
That is the worst, man. When you're like at your home league draft and everybody just like literally pulls up their phone and they know exactly who I want to pick. It's the worst, but at the same time, you know what? I am an analyst first, player second.
Yeah, I don't know, man. The worst is not being a fantasy football analyst because it's just so much fun. I don't care if I get whooped in my home leagues because everyone's drafting off my list. I get to do this for a living every single freaking day, man.
No, I could not live up to it, my friends. If I didn't beat my friends in fantasy football, they would mock me and they'd say they shut my job.
Right. All right, Yates, you're next, buddy. What do you have for us?
Yeah, I'm going to go with one that I hear a lot, specifically in Dynasty rookie drafts, but it also carries over into redraft leagues. And that, my tip here is don't go into your draft with a set plan. And what I mean by that is don't go into your draft with the mindset of, okay, and my first round pick, I'm going to take a running back. And the second pick, I'm going to take a wide receiver. Third pick, I'll take, a running back again, whatever that is. And I mentioned a dynasty rookie draft because I'll get questions on Twitter all the time, or like, hey, I'm going into my dynasty rookie draft. I have picks 1, 4, 7, whatever.
Yep.
And I'm thinking about taking Jonathan Taylor, Jerry Jeudy, CeeDee Lamb. They're listing off these players, and I'm like, well, don't go into your draft with that plan, because what that does is it prohibits you from looking and capitalizing on value, on finding these players that fall to you. If you go in with that mindset, I'm taking a running back in the first round, and Julio Jones, Davante Adams, whoever is still sitting there, Michael Thomas is still sitting there at the eighth pick or whatever, you might just bypass them completely because you were hell-bent on taking a running back. So don't go into your draft with a set plan. It really, really prohibits you.
Tags, anything you want to add to that, buddy?
I mean, this is something that I 100% agreed with when I saw Yates put it on the sheet that he wanted to talk about this. This is why Bobby wanted to rename it draft tips instead of draft strategies, because we don't believe in that you should go into a draft saying I'm taking, wide receiver if I get the 12th pick. You should never, ever do that. There's a lot of questions on Twitter that I do get in terms of like, hey, I have the 8th pick, which means I'm going to have the 14th, 15th pick on the way back. Which 2 players should I target? You have a good idea in the first couple of rounds as to the players that should be there, but it goes back to my first tip and saying anticipate the worst case scenario. Right. Imagine that your top 7 players come off the board, and who's your number 8, and then the same thing on the way back. You have to go in with a plan, right. And we're going to talk about ways to get better at that, going forward as we go through these tips.
I love that call, Yates. I've got my next one, and I wouldn't even call this a tip. I'd call it a cheat code. Now, I'm going to tell you about that in just a second, but first I want to really quickly tell you, we've got a new podcast, the Daily Juice Podcast. It's a new betting-focused podcast that we recently released. Every day, all year round, Betting Pros host Matt Peralt will spend 15 minutes sharing his insight and picks on each day's most notable bets across all sports. That includes NASCAR, UFC, MLB, NBA, NHL, and of course, the NFL. The Daily Juice podcast is now available on all major podcast platforms, and you can also listen to it at bettingpros.com/dailyjuice. And Matt is awesome. I'm so glad he's on our team. All right, so here's my cheat code. Don't even draft a kicker. I'm not saying like if you are in a league with no kickers, don't draft a kicker. Of course you shouldn't play in leagues with kickers. What I'm saying is if you're in a league that drafts kickers, don't draft a kicker. What are you doing? You can everyone's going to be streaming a kicker really soon anyway, right? You might as well stream your kicker minutes before kickoff, and instead, now remember this, Tags. Yates, you weren't around for this. 4 years ago, what did we say? Or was it 3 years ago? We said, don't draft a kicker. Instead, grab James Conner just in case Le'Veon Bell gets hurt. Guess what happened? Le'Veon Bell got hurt for the whole season. James Conner was an RB1. The next year, what did we say? We said don't draft a kicker. Instead, draft Kareem Hunt in case Spencer Ware gets hurt. And it happened again back-to-back years. Now, look, the odds of this happening, 5-10%. Every year, somebody's going to get hurt in the preseason for the full year. Last year, it was Lamar Miller. Who knows who it's going to be this year? If it's not an impactful offense, it's not going to matter. But you take your chances. You buy that lottery ticket just in case you strike gold and get a league winner in those 2 or 3 preseason weeks after your draft starts, before the season starts. And if not, you just cut that guy and you pick up your kicker. It is a free lottery ticket. You better take it.
Yeah, this is one that Bobby stands by every single year, and it makes sense. If you're going to wait till your last pick to grab one anyway, that means the top kickers, top defense, whatever, they're going to be gone. So it definitely makes sense to kind of pass on one and just saying, I'll grab one, for the week 1 matchup. A lot of guys stream kickers too. They don't just stick with one throughout the year. And there's definitely studies that, show which kickers have it's almost like people say that they're more predictable than defenses. So you can kind of stream kickers as you go on. So this one makes sense.
Right.
I absolutely agree. I'll just chime in really quick. I absolutely agree with this because the impact that you can have by taking one of those guys, those lottery ticket, kind of players, is immensely more beneficial for your team than in the, if you're in a 16-round redraft league in the 15th round taking a kicker. Like, what good is that going to do you long term Instead, grab a guy like this season. I mean, Mike Boone. Someone like that where if Dalvin Cook does hold out, I'm just throwing out someone off the top of my head. Then Alexander Madison is the main starter, but then Mike Boone is going to get some work. So in that instance, take Mike Boone. And then if we get, news that Dalvin Cook ended his holdout, he gets his contract and he's back, great. Then drop Mike Boone and pick up your kicker then, because that player is still going to be there, because no one in your league is going to be drafting 2 kickers. At least they shouldn't be. So, yeah, I absolutely agree, Bobby.
If anyone's watching on YouTube, by the way, all our podcasts are on YouTube at youtube.com/FantasyPros. You should see my ears perk up when Yates said Mike Boone. It always does the trick. For me, the guy this year is Chase Edmonds. Just
That's
because
a good
I get
call.
it. Kenny Drake is the clear 3-down back in Arizona, right? He's very good. Chase Edmonds is also a very good football player. It's a high-tempo offense. I think they're going to score a lot of points playing from behind. I think Chase Edmonds could be huge if Kenny Drake was to go down.
That's a great call, Bobby.
Benjamin
Yates.
might be just as good.
I like Benjamin too, but I think it's probably Chase Edmonds. We'll see.
Yeah.
Anyway, Yates, it's your pick. You've got, 3 more draft tips.
Are we going to tags first or me?
Oh,
Hey,
Tags did start, didn't he? I'm sorry, everyone.
Bobby
Tags,
just
you're
skips
up,
over
buddy.
me. No, it's all good, man. It doesn't really matter. We're going to get through all these tips
Yeah.
anyway. So my second tip is understand ADP and how to use it. There's a lot of people that question ADP and why do you care about ADP? Why do you do this? Why do you do that? Because it lets you know where you could find value in your drafts. That's why.
Right.
Just because you have a wide receiver as the number 7 wide receiver, like for instance, I have Juju Smith-Schuster as my number 7 or number 8 wide receiver. His ADP is down at wide receiver 17. Because I have him ranked as a guy that should go at the end of the second round, that doesn't mean I have to draft him there. A lot of times he's falling into third, a lot of times the 4th round. So understanding ADP and how to use it to your advantage, you should do that, because our ADP we use on the website is that we go through and there's a consensus ADP. It shows you for each website where that player is going and we form a consensus. You should look at the beginning. Like if there's a player that you don't want to miss out on, you might want to reach 1 round, but you should never reach 2 rounds for a player, because otherwise he would be higher in your rankings than he is. So therefore, it's like understanding ADP and how to use it. It's not to say that you should draft by ADP. It's just understanding where you can find value in your drafts. And if you know that there's a wide receiver that's there for you every single time in the 4th, take a running back in the 3rd rather than grabbing that wide receiver who's going to be available the next round.
That is such a good call, man. And I will also say, know the ADP on the site you're drafting in. Now, if
Yes.
you're drafting in person, consensus ADP is the way to go. If you're drafting on Yahoo Sports, like we had Andy Behrens on yesterday, and we were talking about Raheem Mostert and how all 3 of the Yahoo guys have Raheem Mostert much higher than everybody else. What they do at Yahoo is it's based on their rankings. They recommend their consensus Yahoo rankings, and that drives ADP, not because everybody believes the Yahoo guys, but because those are their rankings, and there's a lot of casual fans who just say, oh, they've got Raheem Mostert as their number 16 running back. Okay, I'm going to draft him at number 17 because he's still available.
Right.
And so his ADP might be ADP RB18 instead of RB25 like we're seeing in most leagues. So it's totally different on every site. Know your site's ADP that you're going to be drafting on.
That's a great point. And CBS is extremely different than like Yahoo. Like I've done CBS drafts and I'm like, where is this player? And you have to go like 2 pages forward and he's there.
Every
so
site's different.
That can definitely impact draft decisions for sure.
All right, Yates, it's actually your turn this time.
No, I will go, building off my last point, I'm going to say be willing to capitalize on value. And especially as we get into, there really isn't much value towards the first couple rounds of your draft, right? Those are pretty much going to be standard. But as you move into the mid rounds of your draft, there are going to be players who people just do not want to draft. Perfect example, David Montgomery. People just do not want to draft David Montgomery this year because he burned them so badly last year. Well, now this season he's falling, and so he is one of these players that I've identified to say that he's in for a huge workload this season. He is absolutely going to produce in some form or fashion. Is he going to be a top 5 running back? No. But he's falling into the 5th round, 6th round at a lot of redraft ADP right now. And if that's the case, then capitalize on it. Take these guys rather than getting locked into a strategy where you say, I'm going to be taking this wide receiver here in the 6th round. David Montgomery is here like a round later than he usually is. I'm going to take him here because he can produce and he's a solid depth piece for my roster at that point. So be willing to capitalize on value because there are going to be these players that continuously fall. And I've done it in, Scott Fishbowl. I was soaking up all these value players because just people do not want to draft them, but they're going to produce.
Not every pick is going to be sexy. You know what? If you end up with Julian Edelman, Okay, he's not going to finish as a wide receiver 1, but he's a really solid wide receiver 3. If he falls around in ADP and you don't love Julian Edelman, you got to take him. It's going to help your team more than the next guy. T.Y. Hilton, same thing. Marvin Jones, same thing. There's guys that just aren't sexy that you have to be willing to draft if they fall far enough.
Yeah, I think you could add on to this one, like be willing to capitalize on value, is that like don't, and I probably should have put it as one of my tips, but don't draft last year's stats. We're not playing 2019 over again. So understand that, like as you mentioned, Yates, is that David Montgomery is a perfect example as a guy that running backs, we look for volume, and now you just think it's bad volume, so you're not drafting him based on last year's stats. That doesn't carry over every single year.
I'm also building off of my last one where I talked about don't draft a kicker, instead buy a lottery ticket. My next tip, buy as many lottery tickets as you can. What is the purpose of a fantasy bench? It's upside. You want that one league winner. You want that Terry McLaurin, right? You want that James Conner, as we talked about, who's just going to break out and help you win your league. If you get a depth piece, how much is that going to help you? Like 2 fantasy points above replacement? Give me a break. I want the guy who can help me win my league. And if I want to win the raffle, I need extra raffle tickets. I want 5 high upside backup running backs. Give me Latavius Murray, Alexander Madison, J.K. Dobbins, Tony Pollard, and then who was the last guy I said? Chase Edmonds. If I get those 5 guys, you know what? I've got a much better chance at getting a potential RB1 out of those 5 guys than I have if I just buy one of them.
You know what? And this plays into something that I was going to add on to, Bobby, as like a bonus tip, is that you need those players in your roster, and the reason you need them, you need players that you can cut. Like, have you ever grabbed someone on your team? Like the reason I was so against drafting Kareem Hunt last year, and I was telling everybody, do not draft him, because he's a guy that you're going to draft and you're going to put him on your bench, and he's going to sit there and sit there and sit there, and it's going to prevent you from picking up the next DJ Chark, Terry McLaurin, these guys that are going off. You need players who you're going to find out immediately if they're going to work out. Like Yates likes Michael Pittman a lot. I like John Ross a lot. Bobby's going to have his guys that he likes, but we understand if they don't have the role that we were hoping they'd have, we can cut them week 1, maybe find the next Phillip Lindsay that's available on the waiver wire, that we have a starting running back for the rest of the year. You have to be willing to do those things. So I love this tip because, again, it might be a miss, and that's fine, because you're going to need players in your roster. I personally have had like a roster before, like last year, AJ Green's on my roster, and there were so many players that I could have cut him for in the beginning, and I didn't, because he was a player that, I don't want to cut him. You need players that you're going to cut on your bench.
You're exactly right. And here's the thing. It's not it might be a miss. It's almost definitely going to be a miss on these guys. But here's the thing. If you have a 7% chance of hitting, and you do that on 5 guys, you know what your odds of hitting become? 31%. That's not bad at all. You got a 31% chance at getting an RB1 for an extended time. Sign me up, baby. You remember Latavius Murray last year when he was the starter for even 2 weeks. He was the best fantasy football running back. Yep. The best. Better than Christian McCaffrey in those 2 weeks. That kind of thing can happen. If you give yourself 5 chances, hey, guess what? You've got a better chance to win your championship than if you give yourself a Larry Fitzgerald or a Darius Geis.
I mean, sure. This year more than ever before, too. Like, we have to talk about this where their training camp may start on time. If it doesn't, then we're talking about players ramping up a whole lot quicker than they usually do, which leads to potentially more injuries than ever before. The uncertainties with COVID-19. If a player contracts, COVID-19, they're out for 2 to 3 weeks. In that instance, you talk about Latavius Murray. Let's say Alvin Kamara just misses 2 to 3 weeks. You have Latavius Murray on your bench who you immediately plug in. If not, then you can trade him. Like in that instance where if you you actually have like 2 phenomenal starting running backs ahead of him, trade Latavius Murray to the Alvin Kamara owner. Hold him hostage. Like get value again. So I think that is something that this season more than ever before, I'm willing to take these shots on the list of guys that you mentioned there, Bobby. I think that's a great list.
All right, Yates, back to you. Oh, I'm trying to skip tags again. It's your turn.
It's all good, man. All right. So my next tip is go with the flow of your draft. And this comes into the not having a strategy piece. It kind of ties into that, but even more so into like a 2-quarterback format, because there's a lot of people starting to move to 2-quarterback super flex leagues. And they say, what's your strategy in that? I don't have one, and I'm dead serious when I say that. Is that you again? We have to go back to assuming the worst case scenario. You have to assume, like, if you're drafting at the number 10 position and you've made your first pick, you're about to make your second pick, and you're looking at it and you're saying, all right, the worst case scenario is that there's a quarterback run and I'm going to wind up with, Derek Carr is my QB1. That's a problem. You can't do that because that's a quarterback that's about to get benched. For Marcus Mariota, there's potential for him to get benched. Well, there's potential for him to get benched.
We can agree to disagree on that.
So it's possible. You want a quarterback as your QB2, a guy that is never going to get benched. You don't have to worry about it. A guy like Daniel Jones is not going to get benched this year. A guy like Joe Burrow is not going to get benched this year. Teddy Bridgewater, Gardner Minshew, these guys are not getting benched. So it's all about playing into your draft and being fluid with the draft and saying, look, if everybody's going running back heavy, does that mean you should go wide receiver heavy? Yes, but you also have to understand, are you okay with having a guy like Chris Carson as your RB1? That could play into it where understand your draft because they all go differently. I mean, last year I was in 17 different redraft leagues, and I could tell you that not one was the same, where, sometimes you'll have wide receivers being overvalued. Sometimes you'll have running backs. Sometimes quarterbacks go because you're in a home league where people just overvalue quarterbacks. Does that mean you should take a quarterback? Absolutely not. But again, you don't want to be stuck missing out on a certain tier because your draft is going in a certain way. You have to try and get the tail end of every single tier that you're aiming for. So, I always want a top 12 running back, a top 12 wide receiver on my roster. Sometimes that doesn't work out, but it just really all depends on the draft and, where I see value.
So let me ask you how far you take this, okay? Because we just did the Scott Fishbowl draft. And no one wants to hear about my fantasy teams, but everyone has a scenario like this sometimes, okay?
Yep.
So it's a tight end premium league. Everyone's taking all these tight ends way too early.
Yep.
And I mean everyone. I'm stuck here. O.J. Howard is my starting tight end. I got O.J. Howard and David Njoku. Just how far do you sacrifice one position if you can just clean up all the other positions? Well, I feel great about my running backs and wide receivers and quarterbacks, but I'm starting O.J. Howard, guys.
Yeah, you're forced. That might be a little too far because he's a backup tight end. He's going to require an injury to get into relevance. That might be a little too far, but I understand what you're saying, though, because in that same draft, my draft, tight ends were going quickly, but not that fast. But running backs were flying off the board, right? And I was in the turn. I had the number 1 pick. So when I was in the turn in the 4th, 5th round, Allen Robinson was still there.
Right.
Amari Cooper was still there. But I only had McCaffrey on my roster. I had taken one quarterback. And I'm looking at it, and I'm like, I should definitely, if I were drafting for strictly points, I would be taking a wide receiver here. But I knew the running backs were flying off the board. And if I didn't take, Le'Veon Bell or David Montgomery or someone like that there, the next time I was going to be looking at someone maybe like a Duke Johnson as my RB2, which is not okay.
Right.
Yes.
You don't want to do that. So, again, I had to remain fluid. In a vacuum, if someone were to ask me, are you going to take Le'Veon Bell or Allen Robinson? I'm taking Allen Robinson.
Of course.
But again, you have to be fluid and understand how your draft is going.
Yates, anything you want to add before your next tip?
No, I completely agree. Every draft is different. And so the best thing that we can do here, and this is the reason why we're doing this podcast now, is to prepare. We need to be prepared for all situations going into our draft. We can't just go into it saying what happens, right? No, you need to be doing the work ahead of time in order to be able to win your draft. And then again, you don't win your league at the draft. That continues on into the waiver wires and trades and all that. But it all starts at the draft. And so being prepared for these different situations to play out is definitely very important.
All right, what do you have for your next tip?
I'm going to say get a bird's eye view of positions. And so I'll specifically mention tight end and quarterback here. And what I mean by this is to go into your draft, or at least a mock draft beforehand, and to say, okay, what does the tight end position look like as a whole as far as ADP? And this is where the mock draft simulator at FantasyPros.com comes in super handy, where you're able to sit down and say, okay, I see that the top 2 tight ends are George Kittle and Travis Kelce. They're going off in the 2nd round. And then I've got these other guys that are kind of filtering in. Oh, Evan Engram's going in the 5th round, 6th round. Okay. And then, but if I take an even further view back, I can see that there are some really, really key values. And this builds off of what Tags was saying with ADP and understanding how to use it, where I have guys like Jonnu Smith and Hayden Hurst that are going super late in drafts. If I take that bird's eye view, I can say, okay, do I want a George Kittle or Travis Kelce in the 2nd round, or an Evan Engram in the 5th or 6th round, or do I want a solid running back or wide receiver or quarterback in that round, in that range, and then I can get Hayden Hurst or Jonnu Smith later on, who I think have a very good chance of finishing around the same range as an Evan Engram, things like that. So taking that bird's eye view allows you to be able to say, going into your draft, okay, I'm presented with, because if I just go on the clock in the second round and George Kittle is staring me in the face, that's going to be very hard to say no to, right? Yeah. George Kittle is an amazing football player, and having him is a guaranteed like top 5 finish at the position.
Right.
But when I take the bird's eye view, do I want George Kittle in the second, or would I rather have Jonnu Smith in the 13th, 14th round? Things like that.
What's your answer?
Jonnu Smith, personally. Just because I can grab a top tier wide receiver or running back at that spot, which are going to be super, super crucial. So,
and I completely agree with you, because I'm either getting Tyler Higbee, Austin Hooper, or Jonnu Smith. I can get one of those 3 guys if I pass up on Kittle. Now, I love Kelsey. I think he's a first round value, but because of the other values you can get at tight end, I heard someone explain it as, the reason that you don't draft Darren Waller and Tyler Higbee this year is because Darren Waller and Tyler Higbee last year. You can always find those guys.
Yeah, and the important thing, too, is to keep in mind that and this is specifically why I mentioned quarterback and tight end, is because those are the positions that you're only starting one player, typically, right? Mm-hmm. In one quarterback leagues and one tight end. But running back and wide receiver, you need depth. You need multiple starting pieces there. So the value of taking a George Kittle in the second versus stocking up on running backs early and then taking a solid tight end in the later rounds, I think balances it out a little bit. Tags, what are your thoughts there?
No, I agree, and I think part of this plays into understanding your scoring settings too.
Right.
And this is a tip I probably should have put in there because it's one of those things I don't think enough people adjust for. I think people Bobby, you were talking about your Scott Fishbowl, like the tight end premium. Everybody overvalued tight ends. I'm sorry, they're still inconsistent players. I think people overvalue them. But when it comes to like a standard format versus a PPR format, I've done literally articles on this based and on how ADP doesn't change nearly as much as it should when you move to a PPR format, and players that are undervalued, overvalued there. So I think all of us agree on these tips, and it's because we've been playing fantasy football for a long time, and that's why I think a lot of people can benefit from the stuff that we're talking about through this episode.
Sure. And it's not just us. If we were to bring any analyst in the industry onto this podcast, they would all agree with all these tips. It's just stuff that you learn from playing a long time and playing in a lot of leagues. Tags, how many leagues did you play in last year? 350?
It was 17 redraft ones. It's
a good thing you had my playbook, man, to manage all those bad boys.
It does, where it's we have and this is totally, I didn't plan it, but if you have as many leagues as I do, and if you're it's really tough to manage waivers, it's tough to manage my schedule. If you're busy Sunday morning, if you go to church, whatever the case may be, my playbook has an autopilot mode where if for whatever reason I'm doing a live stream or I'm doing something adjusting my rankings and a player is a sudden inactive, and it's more important than ever now, because if a player tests positive for COVID Sunday morning, you may not be able to get to your computer. Our My Playbook feature, the autopilot, if a player is inactive, it will automatically swap out the highest player that's ranked that week that you could put into your starting lineup. So
it takes your leagues from ESPN, Yahoo, CBS Sports, My Fantasy League, everything.
Yes, it's awesome.
Cool. It's really cool. Actually, that kind of ties in with my next draft tip. It's to utilize the resources you have available to you. Now, my playbook is for after drafts, right? It'll grade your draft and everything like that. It'll tell you the best waiver wire pickups according to consensus rankings, everything along those lines. It'll help you build your lineups. But for drafting, we've got the Draft Wizard to help practice all your mock drafts and everything. But our best tool, this is amazing. It's our Draft Assistant tool, where you can sync your live draft to the FantasyPros Draft Wizard, and it's basically like you have a team of experts in your war room with you. If you want to bring Mike Mayock into your war room, which in fantasy football is probably Sean Corner, right? Or Justin Boone, or Jeff Ratcliffe, or Jake Seeley. There's all these guys out there that you can invite into your war room with you. And you don't have to listen to what they say, but you can at least get their opinions and say, oh, wow, they really think that I should draft Sammy Watkins here in the 12th round. Maybe I forgot about him. All these guys like Sammy Watkins. Now, I don't know if that's actually true, but that's just an example of the way that it could go. You've got all these guys whispering in your ear. We've seen it on Reddit where leagues have outlawed the use of Draft Assistant Sync because they say that it's cheating. It is that useful. So basically, just take a look around our website. We've got all kinds of stuff that is going to help you. But number one, the Draft Assistant Sync. You can find it at fantasypros.com/draftwizard, and it is basically cheating.
Yep.
Yates, anything you want to add, buddy?
No, I mean, I didn't know about this until like last year. I had no idea that this was even a thing, and I used it last year, and it was incredible. I was like, where in the world has this been? How have I not known about this? And so if you're listening and you do not have my playbook or, anything like that, you really, really need to check this out because it is a absolute game changer for fantasy football.
Yeah, and it's got like pick predictor built in where it'll tell you like there's an 82% chance this guy's going to be gone by your next pick.
that ties into exactly what I was talking about in regards to understanding ADP and how to use it. It basically, we have a million drafts that go through this draft assistant, right? And we keep all that data, and it tells you what are the odds, the percentage chance that player that you're debating is gone by the next time you pick. So if it's telling you there's just a 2% chance, you should probably be willing to take that. Where if it's more of like a 50% chance, you're like, okay, if I really want this player, I need to grab him now because it's a 50-50 shot that he'll be their next pick. There are so many features built in, and we've even added features this offseason in terms of if you want to try 0 running back, 0 wide receiver, all that stuff. It's a fantastic tool we have.
All right, your last one, Tags, and then we're going to go to bad strategies after we all do one more.
All right, this one is a tip that I came up with because of what happened in the live stream that I did on Tuesday. I had someone say something about my team that I drafted, and they said that, you have a couple rookie running backs, your team sucks. And I was like, okay, first off, stop. Don't say that, because if you say that, it shows how uninformed you actually are. I've done an article on what to expect out of rookies in fantasy football, and by each position. Running backs have an elite ceiling the moment that they walk into the league. Now, just because players don't work out, I remember like one of the first years I played fantasy football, Ryan Matthews was taken at like number 4 overall, and he burned a lot of people that year. And so people hold on to that stuff. If they have like a Rashad Penny that they took and they're like, rookie running backs suck. I did an article based on where players were drafted, first round, second round, third round, what their chances are of succeeding, and I break it down in terms of RB1, RB2, RB3, wide receiver 1, and it tells you the odds that a rookie can perform in his rookie season. This year's a little bit different in terms of like, if we have a limited preseason, limited training camps, we don't know how all that stuff's going to work out just yet, but understand what players it's okay to take shots on as rookies, and running backs are absolutely players that you should. We see it. I mean, players are having trouble getting a second contract now in football because teams are using them up during their best years because they understand when a player comes into the league, it's as good as he's going to be as a running back. So don't be afraid to take running backs as rookies in drafts, because that's a common it's something that people struggle with all the time. They don't want to trust rookies, and it's the wrong thing to do.
Yeah, that's interesting, man. And especially like tight ends. Like, you can't trust any rookie tight end. Remember how pumped people were about TJ Hawkinson last year?
Bobby, did you know, it was a fact from an article I did, that before 25, over the last 13 years, the only player who has finished as a top 3 tight end before the age of 25 is Rob Gronkowski, and he did it twice. It just goes to show how rare he was. But it basically says you're not going to get an elite tight end when he comes in the league. People thinking that TJ Hawkinson, Noah Fant, that these guys are going to dominate right away, they were never going to do that. You have to wait a couple years for tight ends. So even O.J. Howard, I mean, I think he turned 25 just last year. He's still a young guy. But yeah, tight ends, you definitely don't want to trust rookies. Wide receivers, not so much. Those are a little bit more rare to find studs their rookie
Or when
year.
they break out, it's usually in the second half. Mike Evans, A.J. Brown come to mind.
Yeah. Well, that definitely. So, but yeah, running backs, don't be afraid of those guys.
All right, Yates, you've got one more. What do you want to add?
Yeah, I'll bring up do as many mocks as possible, but from different draft slots. So going into the mock draft simulator at FantasyPros.com and hitting that randomize button on the draft selection or the draft position there, because that is super important for you to be able to figure out. We mentioned that I hate drafting from the turn in a Superflex league. Well, how have I figured that out? From repetition, from being in multiple Superflex drafts, actual drafts, but then also in mock drafts, to be able to sit and say, okay, what does this look like if I have the 12th overall spot and I'm drafting at the turn? What does it play out like? What does it look like if I'm drafting from the number 1 spot and I, in a redraft league and I get Christian McCaffrey? Okay, well then how am I going to build my roster the rest of the way? So again, building off of what we said before, that you need to be prepared. This is a huge, huge way to be able to do that, is from drafting from different draft slots. Don't always go in and just hit the 6th draft slot because that's where you like drafting from. No, make sure that you're hitting randomize and getting these different spots, because it's going to make you a better and more informed fantasy football player.
I love that call, man. Because here's the thing. We take an entire year, well, not an entire year. We take 8 months off and then we have to teach ourselves to play fantasy football again. And you got to practice. And the only way to practice is due to these mock drafts. And if you do a mock draft on another site, like, okay, it's pretty cool to be able to draft against human users. You can do that on our site now with the mock draft lobby. And you're not going to have the people jacking around taking Tim Tebow first overall and just completely ruining your draft and talking trash in the in the chat or whatever. You can go in there and you can draft against AI teams that are very realistic and give you a great feel for how it goes. Every single draft is different. And here's the thing. You can compete a fantasy football mock draft on Draft Wizard in 5 or 6 minutes.
Yep.
If you want to do 5 drafts during your lunch break, you can get it done.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's great. I mean, it's invaluable. Like, seriously, like, once you realize that you can do mock drafts in 5 minutes, there's no more waiting in lobbies for it to be ruined.
It's
like Bobby
amazing,
said, like someone taking 2 quarterbacks in a 1 quarterback league, they take 2 quarterbacks or 2 tight ends within the first 2 rounds, and you're basically like, well, I just wasted my time. I remember filling up my player, like my queue for the players, and like getting them all in order, putting like 80 players in there, and then it's ruined in the first 2 rounds, and you're like, oh my, why do I do this?
And then everybody's auto drafting and it takes the full 9. Yes. Oh,
yeah,
man. Anyways, if you want to do these mock drafts, fantasypros.com/draft wizard. This is actually what brought me to the Fantasy Pros website, because I was just hoping there was something like this, and I looked for it, draft simulator, and this is what I found. I was like, oh my goodness, this whole website is amazing. And then I applied, and now I get to work here. So thanks, Draft Wizard. All right, here's my last draft tip before we go into bad strategies. And this one, it kind of goes without saying, but you wouldn't believe how many people just completely ignore this. Guys, the DST position is almost all about week 1 matchups, because there's like 3 DSTs that you're actually going to play for the first 4 weeks in the season. You're going to end up cutting virtually all of them. Like, you might hang on to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Maybe they're hot the whole season. But how many times have we seen the DST 1, the Jags, after their amazing year, the Bears after their amazing year, just go completely backwards, not even finish in the top 12. It happens all the time. You can't draft one of these DSTs in the 12th round and expect them to just be gold like they were last season. So what it comes down to is virtually everyone's going to be streaming the position. And if you are, you need to start streaming from your draft, not from after week 1, after you draft, the number 4 defense. What if they have the bad matchup in week 1? In week 1, the Philadelphia Eagles are my number 1 DST. In week 2, they're also a top 3 DST. In week 3, they're also a top 5 DST. I want the Philadelphia Eagles because of what they're going to give me in the first 3 weeks. And then what? I'll cut them, and I'll pick up the next streamer. But the Eagles get Dwayne Haskins in week 1, guys. They get Jared Goff in week 2 playing from behind. They get Joe Burrow in week 3 playing from behind. And I get it, Joe Burrow's a very good quarterback, but playing from behind quarterbacks are more likely to take sacks. They're more likely to throw interceptions. And Joe Burrow, he's a rookie quarterback. I mean, Peyton Manning broke the all-time interception record for a rookie as a quarterback, and he's one of the greatest of all time. Rookies throw more interceptions. All 3 of those matchups are golden.
I agree.
Yep. Yeah, this is a great piece of advice, and I think it starts tying into actually the don'ts. If you guys don't mind, if I just bring up the don't, because basically what Bobby just said, it's drafting a quarterback with a bad week 1 matchup. We talk about streaming quarterbacks all the time and the players that are going to be available to you. But like me, I like Joe Burrow this year. I can't play him week 1. He's going to be playing against the Chargers. If you want to guess that Daniel Jones is going to be a breakout quarterback, which a lot of people have talked about him being a potential breakout star this year because if he has the mobility, he has the weapons in the offense. But again, look at his first 3 games of the year. He's going to be playing against Pittsburgh, against the Bears, against the 49ers. And then even in week 4, the Rams is not a great matchup. So Daniel Jones, Joe Burrow, those are guys that you can't start week 1. So unless you're planning on drafting 2 quarterbacks, understand who this year more than ever, I don't think you can do that. I don't think sometimes I think it's okay if you have deeper benches to draft a backup quarterback and kind of platoon those guys depending on their schedule early in the year. But understand that if you're going to carry just 1 quarterback, you can't draft a player with a bad week 1 matchup that you don't want to start. So unfortunately, Joe Burrow, if I'm going to draft 1 quarterback, I can't draft him.
Yates, I'm looking at my week 1 rankings right now. I've got Joe Burrow quarterback 24. I don't want to start quarterback 24 in the first week. I would rather start Carr. Carr has a good matchup. Garoppolo. Yeah. He has a good matchup. I mean, they're not going to be top 12 quarterbacks week 1, but I've got him in my top 15.
So, guys, really, I exclaimed. I was like, "Oh my word!" But like, we were talking about Daniel Jones' schedule right before we started recording, and we only went up to like week 5. Tags mentioned Pittsburgh, Chicago, San Francisco, the Rams. Week 5 is Dallas. Week 6 is Washington, which is going to be a much improved unit. Week 7 is Philadelphia. Week 8 is Tampa Bay, which is a solid defense. Week 9 is Washington again. Week 10 is Philadelphia. I'm not recommending Daniel Jones as a streamer or starter the first 10 weeks of the season.
I think I could against Tampa. I still think their secondary is suspect, but they're getting better for sure. They got better towards the end of last year, but I'm with you, man.
Awesome.
Last
year they were
train wreck.
Yeah, last year they were a dominant defense.
They were a dominant run defense. I think Saquon will have trouble against them for sure. But the receivers can get it done. But either way, Philadelphia, that team, that secondary is completely different.
Yep.
With Darius Slay back there, I mean, that's going to change the look. I mean, you're not going to attack Philadelphia defense anymore, I don't think.
Man.
Yep. All right, Yates, it's you, man. What are you going with for your first bad draft strategy?
Yeah, well, guys, one of the greatest things about a fantasy football draft is that we can sit down and relax with our buddies. Hopefully, we'll be able to do them all in person this year. And one of the benefits is that we can knock back a few brewskis. Well, one of the things that I'm recommending that you do not do is go past your limit. We all have personal limits. We've all figured them out. I think at this point in life, we've all figured out how many beers is too many. And so know what your limit is. I'm not saying that don't drink at all at your draft, but have one beer, because a bunch of the other guys at your draft are going to get a little bit loose. And so in that instance, you want to be the sharpest guy in the room. You want to be prepared. You want to be ready. And we want every advantage that we can get in our drafts. And so if you're joining the rest of the guys and having a little bit too many, knocking back a few too many, then at that point you prohibit your ability to make the best decisions possible. So it's not don't drink at all during your draft. It's just make sure that you're not drinking too much.
Nailed it, man. I mean, is 90 minutes worth of enhanced fun really worth ruining an entire fantasy football season worth of fun? Because the most fun thing is winning your league, right?
Right.
I mean, I was looking at what you had on the sheet, Yates, and it said drinking at the draft. I was like, I just want to be on board to say that I completely disagree with this take. But then you said don't go past your limit, and I was like, I agree, because there's guys that definitely go past their limit. It's not. I mean, if you're able to have a beer or two, that's fine. But obviously, just wait to do your partying after the draft, so you at least remember who your team is in the morning.
That's a good way to put it. All right, here's my first draft tip. Don't draft a quarterback. Any quarterback, I don't care how much you love them, at or before their ADP. Because there's going to be some quarterback that falls 4 rounds past their ADP. I don't care if you love Carson Wentz this year. If he falls into the 11th or 12th round, you better take him.
Yeah, this is something I talked with Sigmund Bloom about on his podcast yesterday. We were talking about how the industry drafts, we devalue the quarterback position, I think, too much. I mean, if you can get Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson in the 3rd round, do it.
Sure.
I don't really care who.
Really, you take Mahomes in the 3rd round, man? I wouldn't take him until the 5th, maybe the 6th.
I would absolutely take him in the 3rd round.
Absolutely take Mahomes in the 3rd.
Yep, I would take Lamar Jackson there too. I think that those guys can deserve consideration at the end of the 2nd, to be honest, because I think that's where you get into players like Odell Beckham that you're kind of okay. I like him, but I can't pretend that there's not concerns. If Mahomes is on the field, dude, he's a top 2 quarterback. That's just the way it is.
Regardless, though, that's after their ADP.
Right, that is still after, and that's why I'm agreeing with your point, but at the same time, there's a fine line. Don't be afraid to take one of those elite quarterbacks, but if you miss out on one of those guys, I would probably take Dak in the 5th or 6th round, but then after that, the quarterbacks just continue to fall down my board. But I do agree with Bobby, because ADP on quarterbacks is definitely way too high, and that's why we tell a lot of people stream quarterbacks. But again, if you're in a league where people all they do is listen to the late round quarterback approach and this and that, take the value if it's there. Again, those top 2 quarterbacks, I'll take them in the 3rd round every time.
Here's what it comes down to. And Tags, you brought this up with your boom bust and everything in between, that typically every single year there are 4, maybe 5 or 6 quarterbacks who outproduce the most highly recommended streaming quarterback every week. We're not talking about the best guy who was on waiver wires. We're talking about the guy who, if you look at our consensus waiver wire rankings, was the number 1 streaming quarterback. Last year it was Ryan Fitzpatrick for a lot of weeks, Ryan Tannehill for a lot of weeks. Even Gardner Minshew was a good pickup for a lot of weeks. Because of the matchups they were in, they outproduced all but 4 starting quarterbacks in fantasy. And guess how many of those guys were drafted outside the top 100 picks? 2 of them. So that means there were 2 quarterbacks drafted in the top 100 picks that were better than the streaming quarterback. The quarterback position just does not matter as much in fantasy. Now, that's why you should play in a super flex league, but a lot of you don't play in super flex leagues. So just wait at quarterback. You're going to be able to get a great value.
Bobby, I want to tag on this because then the article will come out. I think the first week of August is when we're planning for the boom bust and everything between series. The average top 12 quarterback performance last year was 19.2 fantasy points. How many quarterbacks do you think hit that mark in more than 50% of their games?
Man, last year? It depends. Are you talking quarterbacks who played the full season?
Well, that's the thing. If you eliminate guys that played less than 12 games, there's just 4 of them. But if we include Matthew Stafford, Ryan Tannehill, and Drew Brees, Tannehill and Brees played 11 games, but there were just 7 quarterbacks, just 7 all year, who performed as a QB1 more than half the time, which is, again, if we're streaming, if we can't hit more than 50% of the time, we're doing something wrong.
Like typically, you can get a streamer who's like ranked QB4 or QB5 consensus for the week.
Exactly. So you should be able to hit those 60, 65% marks, which is, I mean, Dak Prescott was a QB1 62.5% of the time last year. So if you're able to stream and do that, again, I mean, Patrick Mahomes was only a QB1 or better 57% of the time last year. And again, the one game that he missed.
That's drafted him that 3rd round, man.
Well, right. It was a weird year for him in terms of like, I think touchdowns are going to bounce back. Like it almost went too far in the other direction for Mahomes last year. But
the injury certainly didn't help.
And missing the one full game against the Broncos that he was playing, that obviously brought down his percentage a little bit. But still, it just goes to show that quarterbacks, you can stream them and do perfectly fine.
Okay, I got to push back. I know this is a draft strategy podcast, but just how far back do you think Patrick Mahomes' touchdowns are going to bounce back? Because he was still at 5.4% last year. That's Tom Brady's career average. Are you saying that Patrick Mahomes is so much better than Tom Brady?
Well, hold on. You're comparing different eras, though. Yeah. I need you to compare the eras to look at Brady's touchdown percentage over the last 3 years. Because the NFL
over the last 3 years, Tom Brady's touchdown percentage is 4.8.
And he hasn't been very good. And then you look
at 5 years. Let's go back 5 years.
I'm telling you, if you were to take the QB rating from the 2018 season and the 2019 season, I think they're both top 10 all time. Like if you were to take the whole league and just put them among quarterback rating all time, the NFL is easier than ever to pass. It's a passing league. We know it. You know, they're changing pass interference calls. You can't touch quarterbacks. You can't do this. So it's a different league. So I can't say you can compare that to Tom Brady. But I mean, it all comes back to, do I think Patrick Mahomes, he's a guy that you play against any opponent. You don't ever worry about sitting him. You know what I mean? Like against the Steelers, you might be like, all right, I'm not expecting a top 5 performance, but you're never going to bench him. Him and Lamar Jackson, maybe Dak Prescott, those are the only quarterbacks that I can say that about.
Yeah, I think those are the only 3. I agree with that. And I want to say that you're wrong, Tags. I went back 8 years on Tom Brady, 5.2% touchdown rate. I'm not willing to say quite yet that Patrick Mahomes is considerably better than Tom Brady over the last 8 seasons.
I mean,
I'm not drafting Patrick Mahomes.
I have him down for 32 passing touchdowns and a 5.61 touchdown rate. So I'm not projecting anywhere near his 50 touchdowns that he had in 2018. Right. But yet, that with those numbers, he's still the quarterback 2 in my rankings.
I have 36 touchdowns, 6.1 touchdown rate.
Who's winning our bet, by the way, Tags? Total touchdowns, that includes rushing touchdowns. Dak Prescott face Patrick Mahomes.
It's Mahomes.
Haha.
Right,
Mahomes, dude, I don't know if you realize this, but Mahomes can rush for 5 touchdowns. That can happen.
He could. Yeah, he absolutely could. He's got good legs on him.
Yeah.
All right, we'll see what happens on that one. I'm going to win that one and the Tannehill bet. Now let's see who's up. Tags, you got 2 more.
All right, where am I at on this list? We're getting off the rails a little bit. All right, so this one I am 100% guilty of myself, and again, we're learning as we go, right? Do not be optimistic about preseason injuries. Last year, I drafted way too much A.J. Green, and I paid for it. I mean, even in some auctions, I'm like, guys, I have so much exposure to A.J. Green, but if you're going to let me have him for $10, I'll do it. And it turned out to be the worst thing ever. Sometimes it's going to work out in your favor, but a lot of times it's not. So guys like Deebo Samuel this year, unfortunately, I'm not going to be drafting him. I asked myself, I'm like, all right, at what point in the draft am I going to feel comfortable drafting him? And knowing what I know and learning from my past experiences, basically he'd have to fall to one of my last picks for me to take a chance, because he's a guy that I can cut if he's not on the field. So, don't be optimistic about preseason injuries. Take them seriously and understand that, especially if a player had surgery or whatever, just even if doctors are saying he should be back on the field in 2 to 3 weeks,
right?
Most of the time you're going to anticipate doubling that.
My major wake-up call, and some people listening can relate, and I'm so sorry for recommending picking Andrew Luck that year when he didn't play the entire season, because they were like, okay, he might be back for week 1. Okay, he's probably going to miss a couple of weeks. They didn't put him on the PUP list, and I was like, okay, I'm drafting Andrew Luck, man. I'm getting him for like a QB9. He's the second best quarterback in football. And then he didn't play the first 6 weeks. I'm like, what in the world is going on here? He didn't play the whole season. So I kept him for 8 freaking weeks. It never works out. I can't think of a single time where it has worked out.
So real quick, Yates, I want you to chime in here. At what point are you saying it's not a bad enough injury? Like if a running back suffers a high ankle sprain, is he someone that you're going to like move way down your draft board?
This is so dependent upon the player too. Like if they have it, like, okay, let's say Geis. Darius Geis tweaks his hamstring.
Do not draft.
If Darius Geis just tweaks his hamstring, it just comes out. It's a minor thing. Like at that point, no, I'm completely off. I mean, I'm completely off to begin with. That is ADP. But like I'm completely off because at that point, he's shown that he cannot stay healthy. A Jerick McKinnon, like these guys who just are perennially injured. And so at that point, I am not going anywhere near them no matter what their injuries are. Obviously, it's a case-by-case scenario where, it depends on the injury and all that. So it's kind of a cop-out answer there, Tags, but it really does depend on the situation.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it. Yates, you're up next. What's your next bad draft strategy?
Guys, don't draft a backup tight end or backup defense. If you're in your draft and you draft a defense in the 12th round, well, please, first, do not do that. But then if you do that and then you follow it up by drafting another backup defense in the 16th round, you are sacrificing what we've talked about earlier with a recommendation and a tip is to take these lottery tickets. That in that situation, you have now, handcuffed yourself to holding 2 defenses on your roster instead of taking a dart throw player, which then you can drop later on and then pick up a backup defense if you want to. Again, I'm not recommending that you do that, but if you really are hellbent on rostering 2 defenses, don't draft 2 defenses. In that instance, take the lottery pick and then pick up your defense later on because they are still going to be there.
Now, Yates, I'm gonna give you a scenario. All right, for among the tight ends, I agree with the defense. There's absolutely no reason you should have 2 defenses. Tight end. Let's pretend that you are one. You took George Kittle in the first and then the second round. Mm-hmm. End of the second round, you got George Kittle, and you're happy about that, right? But then you get down to your pick 14, pick 15 down there, and you see Jonnu Smith on the board. You see him on the board, or you see someone we love Hayden Hurst, and let's say that your league is just not hip to him, and he falls in that territory. I think in that scenario, I might be okay taking that tight end because if you, like last year, we had Mark Andrews who was being drafted outside the top 12. And if you had Kelsey and if you drafted Andrews thinking that he could break out, you have a trade piece available because it's hard to get your hands on the tight ends like that. So would you change at that point?
I think I would. Yeah, I think I would. But that is a very specific scenario.
For sure. Yeah,
So as far as in this context of speaking in generalities of don't draft a backup tight end or backup defense, I think. But then if we dive into specifics and we say, okay, I took this tight end in the second round and then Jonnu Smith falls 2 rounds later than where his current draft position is, then, at that point, yes, I would be taking Jonnu Smith because he's a lottery ticket. He falls into that bucket, right? Hayden Hurst is a lottery ticket. He falls into that bucket. So, I think at that point I would. But in generalities, I would not.
Yep. Yeah, and I would say another exception to that rule, and there's limited exceptions, is that Dallas Goedert is a high-end backup. Now, I've never recommended this about any tight end before until Dallas Goedert last year, that if Zach Ertz were to go down, just like if Alvin Kamara were to go down and Latavius Murray would be an absolute stud, if Zach Ertz were to go down, Dallas Goedert would be, a top 3 or top 4 fantasy tight end?
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah, he should be, yeah.
He falls into that same bucket though. Is a lottery ticket, So I don't hate the suggestion.
He's like one of those handcuff running backs you're talking about, taking a lottery pick with at the end and seeing if there's an injury.
I'm glad you guys were still talking because if you're watching on YouTube, I knocked my headphones out and I said something. And I was wondering what happened. I hope they're filling the space and they're not waiting for me to transition to my next point. My next point actually is about those high upside bench spots, and I alluded to this earlier, but it's not just when you're getting these raffle tickets. I'm not only drafting Latavius Murray if I've got Alvin Kamara. You don't have to draft only the handcuff to your starting running back. You get the best backup running backs possible. It doesn't matter because if you didn't have Le'Veon Bell but you still drafted James Conner, guess what? Now you've got a free RB1 that year, right? Or you can just trade him to the Le'Veon Bell owner and hold him absolutely hostage and go out there and get Odell Beckham from him.
Now, is this year, and this is something I really wanted to talk to you guys about because I'm really torn in the situation. I'm always with you, Bobby, in terms of you don't even worry about who's on your team. You just take the best handcuff. Do we worry about a little bit more this year with COVID in terms of like getting your backup? Like, so if you have someone like Alvin Kamara, do you make it a point to get Latavius Murray just because? And it's not to say Latavius Murray shouldn't have been like a guy that was one of the top end handcuffs anyways, but like David Johnson, Duke Johnson, do you pair up those guys knowing what we know and that it's realistic that we're going to see a lot more guys miss 2 to 3 weeks at a time? And you're not necessarily hoping to get a lottery ticket that you could trade away, but more about filling your starting lineup with actual starting running backs.
Yates, I've got my answer. You go first.
Yeah, I think for me, if it lines up, right? If I'm on the clock in the, I don't even know what Latavius Murray's ADP is. Off the top
we'll say the 11th or 10th or 11th round.
10th, 11th round, and I'm on the clock, and Latavius Murray is still sitting there, and I took Alvin Kamara in the first round. Yes, I will take Latavius Murray. If in the situation where if I didn't take Alvin Kamara and I'm in the 10th or 11th round and Latavius Murray is sitting there, yeah, I'll probably still take Latavius Murray, sure, because he's a high upside. So I'm not going out of my way to handcuff my starting running back. I'm just going to be looking to take the value where it lands.
So you're not like the people last year who drafted Todd Gurley in the 2nd and Darrell Henderson in the 5th and Malcolm Brown in the 10th just because they wanted to make sure.
That's terrible.
I cannot believe people did that.
Guys, I'm talking about a couple. I'm not talking about like multiple rounds, but I'm saying like if you came up in your board, let's say you have Latavius Murray as your RB 38 and you get on the board and your RB 35, 36, and 37 are still available, but you have Alvin Kamara, I might be willing to reach those 3 or 4 spots to get Latavius.
Not a full round or a round and a half higher, though.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking, yeah.
Yep.
My answer to the COVID thing isn't that I'm more likely to draft there. I mean, I guess I'm a little bit more likely, like what you're saying. I would surpass, 2 or 3 running backs to go get Latavius Murray, 5 Alvin Kamara. But what I'm doing instead is I'm drafting 8 running backs because I'm going to have 3 every single week who are going to hit.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I usually do. I usually don't even care who my running backs are. I just take the highest top end, like Tony Pollard, sure, Latavius Murray. Those are the guys you target. But if you get Devin Singletary, do you take Zach Moss? Because if Singletary misses time, Moss is like suddenly a top 15 running back. And I start thinking about that with the likeliness that more players start missing games this year.
I think if Singletary was to go down, Moss would be better in fantasy than Singletary.
I agree.
I agree with that.
All right, Tags, you're up, man. Last one. Make it a good one, baby.
Well, last one is it's funny because I did this in a draft, like a mock draft, actually not too long ago because I wanted to see how it would work out. And it wasn't as bad as I thought, but I in general, I believe it is a bad strategy to draft both a quarterback and a tight end early. If you want to get Lamar Jackson on your team, cool. If you want to get Patrick Mahomes on your team, cool. I talked about taking them in the 3rd round. But if you were to take someone like Travis Kelce or George Kittle in the 2nd round, I do not believe you should be taking a quarterback in one of those early rounds. And I say that because it puts you in such a hole at running back and wide receiver, 2 positions that you can't miss on. We can find streamers at tight end. We can find streamers at quarterback. We cannot find streamers at running back very often, especially top tier ones that you're going to find ranked in the top 10. Finding guys at wide receiver. I mean, even if a top tier wide receiver, like let's say Julio Jones went down, sure, Calvin Ridley is going to get a bump and he's going to be good, but does that mean Russell Gage is all of a sudden going to be a top tier receiver? No, it's a lot harder to find wide receivers and running backs than it is to find tight ends and quarterbacks. So if you want to take a tight end, I get it. If you want to take a quarterback, so I only get it with 2 players. But if you do that, just make sure you don't go tight end or, you don't take both of them in the same draft.
Yates, I'm going to give you a scenario, okay? This is the best case scenario, the most tempting scenario to pass up, okay? You got Christian McCaffrey at 101.
Yep.
You get to the turn. George Kittle and Lamar Jackson are still sitting there. Now, all your favorite running backs are gone. Jacobs, Drake, Chubb, Sanders. The next best running back on your boards may be Chris Carson or I'm not even going to say Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Let's say he's taken because I know you like Edwards-Helaire. Mm-hmm. Gurley's out there. The wide receivers, all the top dogs are gone as well. Do you take George Kittle and Lamar Jackson knowing you already have CMC?
Oh, man. In this specific
I can't do it.
It's tempting to get like the top player at all 3 positions. It's really tempting.
Well, this is, excuse me. So in this instance, I actually might because CMC is like having 2 like top tier running backs, right? Like 2 like RB2s, combined. He's so dominant at the position, so he kind of makes up for it. But I think that would just be too hard to pass up. But, man, that would be really, really hard to pull the trigger on.
I don't know. Dags, what do you think, man? Could you do it?
I think I could do it. It depends. All right. If it's a 10-team league, abso-friggin-lutely
Oh, sure,
I could.
sure.
Because if it's a 10-team league, you just want studs. That's all you want. Every team is going to be stacked. You need the top tier talent. In a 12-team league, it gets a little different. It's going to be rare to see Kelsey or Kittle at the 2-3 turn. I would definitely be taking one of those guys. But taking the quarterback would be difficult. And that's what I did in that mock draft. On that one mock draft I had is that I had the first pick and I took McCaffrey. I got Kittle there and then I took Mahomes. And I was looking at it and I'm like, I kind of like it, but if the people you're drafting with are sharp, it's going to be really difficult because by the time it comes back to you at 4 or 5, you're probably going to be looking at guys that are more like RB3s, wide receiver 3s, and it's going to be difficult. But at the same time, again, as Yates mentioned, having Christian McCaffrey definitely helps you feel a little bit better about it. But I think
who was your RB2, like Le'Veon Bell?
My advice is maybe David Montgomery.
Yeah.
But my advice is to go into a mock draft, do that. Try and do it. See what your team looks like. See if you feel comfortable with it. And again, assume that worst case scenario and saying, all right, am I okay having David Montgomery as my RB2 if I have Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson and George Kittle? Those are the questions you need to be asking yourself.
It's a great way to put it, man. I like that. Yates, give us your last bad draft strategy.
Yeah, I'm going to fly through this one. We're about to enter into the season on Twitter where people are pointing out playoff matchups for players already. Saquon Barkley has an amazing playoff matchup. Guys, stop talking about that. So much can freaking change by the time that we get to
will
the playoffs.
Change, not
will
can,
change.
will.
Yes, will. We're talking about Joe Mixon. Last season, started out the season terribly, and then turned it on towards the end of the year. These kind of players it changes so much. And so for us to look ahead all the way to playoff weeks of week 14, 15, 16, and to make our draft decisions based on that, I'm not on board with that. I think that's a terrible draft strategy.
I remember a lot of people doing this a few years back with Jameis Winston, right? He gets the Saints twice in the fantasy playoffs. Oh my goodness, I have to draft Jameis Winston. And then guess what? The Saints had a top 5 secondary in football because it's so hard to predict these defenses.
Yep.
Yeah, and we've learned this lesson too many times. Don't do it. We all fell for it when we were like 16 years old. We're not anymore, so I don't know. Here's my last one, okay? Do not wing your draft. And I get it. You guys are listening in July, so you're probably not doing it. But then there's a lot of people who are going to be listening to this show in August. And we have so many resources. We've already talked about them. I'm just going to highlight them again. The Draft Sync Assistant, which has been called cheating. The Draft Wizard, where you can practice hundreds of mock drafts and get a different result every single time. Get your practice in. We've also got some articles. I'm going to give Yates and Tags a chance to hype up their favorite article coming up, just so that you guys can look forward to it and bookmark it for your drafts. Tags, what's yours?
Oh, mine would probably be the there's so many to choose from, man. It's so difficult. I would say probably the boom bust and everything in between series that I do. Because I do it on every position and it goes through. And, when we look at someone like, Jarvis Landry last year, you can see that he finished as a top 15 wide receiver, but then you go and look at boom bust and everything in between and you see that he performed as like a wide receiver 2 just 31% of the time. You're like, whoa. I mean, people could talk about him finishing as a wide receiver 2, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can rely on him for a wide receiver 2. What you want when you're drafting positions is you want at least 50% of the time. And that's the way I break it down, is that I go through ADP and you could see the charts of these players, and you're going to find players that stand out and you're like, he does not even belong in this tier. And then you're going to find guys that are later in the draft saying, wow, he belongs like 3 tiers higher. Like, what are we doing? Why aren't we looking at this guy? Because they may not be sexy or whatever, but every player has a role on your fantasy team, and boom bust and everything in between is something that kind of shows you which role they should be playing.
Yates, what are you working on that you're really excited about, buddy? Because here's the thing. We want to see you guys win your fantasy drafts. That's why we're here. I mean, it's a lot of fun to do this job, but I care more about the success of our advice and analysis than I care about my individual fantasy football teams. The best day of the year for us is when the season ends and we get all of these tweets, literally hundreds of tweets pour in, and they say, thank you for telling me to draft Christian McCaffrey in the second round. I won my league because of that. And that makes me glow. It's the best thing. We want you guys to win our leagues, and when we're writing our articles, that's what we're thinking about. So, Yates, what's going to help people win their leagues?
Yeah, completely. Well, this season I'm going to be doing, obviously this is my first year at FantasyPros and doing a weekly article, so I'm not doing anything as big as the primer. No, thank you. But I will be doing, no, thank you. I am going to be doing a projections article each week, which will be breaking down all 16 matchups, for the week, and doing the projections for every single player in it. I'm going to be doing a mini series based off of that before the season starts, where I'll be looking at like notable contract year players, notable guys on new teams, notable over 30 players like this that I'm going to be listing out my projections for them. So I think it's going to be a really, really interesting article, and I recommend that a lot of people read it.
Yates is a big projections guy. I know he's a little bit newer to the show, so a lot of you guys are getting acclimated to what he brings to the table. The dude knows his numbers. He's awesome. I'm so glad to have him on our team. Here's what I'm working on, okay? He talked about his weekly article. You guys know my weekly article. It's the Quick Grades article. It's like the primer, but instead of being able to read it in 2 hours, it's like a just look at the charts in 5 minutes. I give you my instant analysis. Now, Tags goes way into depth. If you've got a lot of extra time, you gotta read the primer. It is so good. It's way better than my article. If you're really busy, you're running off to church or whatever, and you need to set your lineup, look at the Quick Grades article really quick. I'll give you the analysis. And I have something similar to that going on for the draft. In fact, my next article is coming out next week, in 2 weeks, where I'm going to be talking about quick grades for the draft. I mentioned their surrounding talent, the volume they're expected to get, their actual ability, all kinds of things along those lines. And so you can just have the instant analysis if you want to look at a color-coded chart, which is kind of my specialty.
Yep. Nope. Comparing everything together, I think we're going to give you everything you wanted this season and more. So as informed as you want to be, we're going to inform you.
Exactly, yeah. And again, if you want to check out all our tools, fantasypros.com/draftwizard is where you'll want to live. And also don't forget to check out the Daily Juice podcast with Matt Peralt. It's 15 minutes of Matt Peralt with the Betting Pros host sharing his insight on picks every day, most notable bets from NASCAR to UFC, MLB, NBA, NHL, and of course NFL. You can check out that podcast, The Daily Juice, at bettingpros.com/dailyjuice. Yates, Tags, that was a lot of fun, man. I love talking draft tips, especially because they're not draft strategies. Draft strategies.
I'm just happy that we're getting closer to draft season, which is because we're that much closer to football season, and that makes me happy.
All right, guys, give us all a follow on Twitter if you don't already. We're at Bobby Fantasy Pro, at Mike Tagliere NFL, and at Kyle Y NFL. For Kyle Yates and Mike Tagliere, I'm Bobby Sylvester. Thanks for listening, and enjoy your football.
Thanks for tuning into the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel. While you're here, don't forget to check out the featured videos. While you're at it, go over to Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Fantasy Pros to get news and updates throughout your season to help you dominate the competition.